Hello, my name is Atticus, and this video essay will be on Hispanic and Latina representation in US media. Just to clarify what that means, um, in doing this research, I didn't pick a lot of films that are from Latina or Hispanic countries. I focused mainly on films that were made here that have Hispanic or Latina representation in their films. Some of the films that have been included may be from Hispanic countries but had a impact on U.S. culture or had a very specific representation that impacted the U.S. or some sort of international awards. For this video, we're first going to go over the general stereotypes and expectations and roles that Hispanic or Latino people tend to play in film or what it has been historically. And then we'll briefly go over Latino representation pre-1950s, and then from the 50s onwards to current times, we'll go a little bit more in depth about what historical events may impact the films coming up in industry at the time, and we'll go over a few examples or mention a few examples of specific films that have representation that are a decent or good representation of the cinematic climate of the time. So, what are the stereotypes of Hispanics and Latina people in media, specifically film and TV? I think the most common is probably el bandito, or the criminal, the gang member, the any person who's kind of shady. The stereotype tends to fit men more often, but can include women on the occasion. These characters tend to, be gang members, drug dealers, or in some sort of drug ring of some kind. This stereotype comes from deep-seated racism, obviously, but tends a lot to come out of the 90s and 2000s when we had a lot more worry about cartels and drugs and all of those kinds of things, and we started in the US blaming it on immigration and Hispanic people. In terms of women, there's two more common stereotypes. The most common is like crazy girlfriends, like ill-tempered, crazy, kind of sexual women who do what they have to do to get what they want. This kind of plays into a femme fatale kind of role, but these women and these characters tend to be more violent and more direct and blunt. The second, less common, is the subservient wife, I would call it. These women fit a more white standard. They tend to be very religious, which is usually, from my experience in my viewings, Catholicism. They tend to be, good wives, taking care of the family, the children. These tend to be the good women, especially compared to their counterpart. They are less common. They are not seen as often in media, but when you do see them, they often play very minor roles. Some of the more general stereotypes include being unhygienic, being poor, or being broke in some sort of cases. A lot in older films, Hispanic people tend to be servants or workers in farms or fields or anything like that, some sort of subservient role to the main characters. And then the other most common is immigrants or the alien, as a lot of older films will dub them. This has kind of gone away in the past decade or two. There are definitely still some representations of the alien, but it tends to be less derogatory and more just a part of those characters. We won't talk much about representation predating the 50s because a lot of these films tend to be very similar. They tend to take place in some sort of Western setting. Men tend to be in these kind of stoic often bendito type roles, and women tend to be highly objectified and sexualized in these films, seen as like temptresses, femme fatales, and just sensual overall. Um, a lot of these films also focus on like Pancho Villa or characters sort of like that, conquerors kind of characters. The 50s and 60s were a pretty big break in the film stereotype for Hispanic people. You can really break out of that Western, like Southwestern setting and start moving into smaller towns, more urban, more centralized stories. Some of the big events that could impact the films of this era and onward are the Cold War, the upwards movement in Chicano beliefs and the Chicano movement, the Hollywood blacklist, which really like it made representation a lot harder from this point, um, from the 50s to some parts of the 60s and 70s, and the Big Five monopolies. One of the more notable, more recent discoveries of films from this time period is Salt of the Earth. It's one of my favorite films, especially for representation and accurate representation of what life actually could have looked like at the time for Hispanic people. The 60s and 70s are possibly the worst time for Hispanic representation following the blacklist and a lot of the racism that comes out of the Cold War. But the films of this time tended to address political and social issues regarding Latina identity or Hispanic identity, or they tended to lean heavily Western. So the divide of earlier genre tends to come back. Really popular films that come out of the time is the very brief role in Lawrence of Arabia and West Side Story. West Side Story gets adapted many times in the future, and I think it's a good time marker of when Hispanic representation becomes more acceptable again. The 70s to the 80s saw a lot more independent studios and filmmakers making film. So you got a lot more small studios um, allowing more representation after the 60s and 70s with the blacklist. Um, this the 70s was known for its upward alternative movements and more progressive values, and this was the start and the coining of the war on drugs, which we'll continue to see and plays a huge role on even modern Hispanic representation. This is also the time that the Nosotros Foundation was coined. It was coined in 1970 by Ricardo Montalban. It is a organization meant to empower Latina voices and to not only be present but thrive in film and TV and on stage. Some of the notable films at the time include Please Don't Bury Me Alive, Alambrista, and Once in a Lifetime. The 80s to 90s saw more nuanced perspectives and analysis on Hispanic experience, and this will be an upward trend. Some of the more notable historical events include increase in dictatorships in South American countries, Reagan's election, and Reagan continuing on as president, the Cold War, AIDS epidemic, and increase in immigration. This is something that pops up a lot more in films in the 80s and following. This is also the birthplace of a more modern representation of urban violence that continues on to a lot of TV shows and film today. Some notable films include Zoot Suit and Born in East LA. The 90s to the 2000s gave us more explicitly Hispanic and Latina stories that were mainstream. These identities were more acceptable or more interesting to a wider audience, so they tended to get more screen time or bigger screens. Some notable events include the increase of everyday representation in media, which includes biopics, but it also includes less violent storytelling for Hispanic people. the ending of the Cold War, the war on terrorism, and a peak in crime and violence all over the US, which includes a lot of targeted racial attacks and shootings. The notable films of this era include Selena, My Family, and The Mask of Zorro. Lastly, I decided to do 2000s to current. I just think it makes more sense to do it this way, but because a lot of the representation following 2020 is very similar to the representation following the end of the 2010s and some earlier too. A lot of the representation coming out of this era was on sitcoms, and there's a lot more representation of everyday life in TV overall. There's more of a focus on true everyday Hispanic representation. There's also an increase of drug and cartel type shows following the arrest of El Chapo. Some notable events include 9/11, the Obama election. A lot of that violence and that started in the 90s started ending out in 2000s. The Iraq War, and of course COVID and the Trump election. You will notice a lot of these characters in this representation tends to be more family oriented than most of the other representation because of that focus on everyday life. Films and TV that have representation include Spy Kids, Sin Nombre, Modern Family, Narcos, Roma, and Hamilton, which is technically a stage musical but was filmed and put up as a film and did extremely well. One final thing I want to mention is how incredibly whitewashed Latina representation and Hispanic representation is in media. The most recent example I can think of is the In the Heights movie. In the Heights was a stage musical, and it was known for being incredibly inclusive, hiring darker skinned Latinos, black people, and a bunch of more native people to New York. And in the film, a lot of the characters that were known for being black and being Afro-Latino got cut, and they got turned into light-skinned characters. This is a very dangerous thing to happen. It eliminates a ton of nuance and experience in these characters' lives, but you will notice that a lot of actors who play, especially in TV shows, who play Latina characters or show off Latina representation tend to be lighter skinned, and this is something that we can definitely look to the future and think that's not what we want to continue, and it's something that we could definitely change. Well, I hope you enjoyed this very brief history on Hispanic and Latina representation in U.S. film and TV. My name is Atticus. I hope you have a great day.